Hello, I'm Llewellyn King. I'm executive producer and host of White House Chronicle on PBS. And I've been writing about nuclear power in Washington for nearly 50 years. In the 60s, there was an enormous enthusiasm for nuclear. And if you had some different scheme, you weren't encouraged, but there was room. The atomic establishment consisted of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, which directed the Atomic Energy Commission, which had its way in everything. The Joint Committee was different from any other organ of the Congress, any other committee, because it was a joint committee that could introduce legislation. None other ever has, and it's an experiment which will not be repeated. The result was it was a kind of world of its own. People who were on it were devoted to nuclear, but they had their own view of it. And it didn't matter whether the Senate was in charge or the House was in charge, and there was no separation between the parties. One of the people, by the way, on the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy was Al Gore's father, who was just as passionately pro-nuclear. The players and names are now sort of lost in history. John Pastori from Rhode Island, Chet Hollifield, the very powerful House member, also chairman of the Government Operations Committee in the House. And I am one of the few people who actually knew Alvin Weinberg. I also saw, at that time, thorium get pushed out by the atomic establishment of the day. The light water industry, the industry we have, is very defensive. It serves the utilities, not the vendors, not the scientists, not the engineers, but the operators, the utilities. They are in the catbird seat. They control the general view expressed by the nuclear industry, and they're timid. They don't want to say nuclear is better than coal, it's cleaner than natural gas, because they have a lot of sunk investment in coal and because they're buying natural gas very cheaply. They never want to be put in the classic advertising situation of saying, this is better, we are moving ahead, this is superior. When you come along and you say a reactor is going to be much better, safer perhaps, than previous reactors, this alarms them because of the sunk investment and the fear for the fleet that they have.
The hearing of the Subcommittee on Energy will come to order.
Numerous engineers who are renowned engineers, people who know what they're doing, tell me that there are a number of approaches that would eliminate the leftover waste problem. But every time I hear about it, coming back with what will be built, again, it's light water reactors. I don't understand what's going on here. Why are we spending money to build reactors based on the same concept that we have been building ever since World War II?
I believe that the light water reactors for the foreseeable future will be a bridge between the industry of today and an industry of tomorrow.
What we've got is not a bridge to tomorrow, but a protection of the status quo.
My constituents were always asking me about this. Does thorium have a place in our nuclear future?
Given that we have made a massive commitment in this country to a uranium-based cycle, I see no compelling reason to move towards a thorium cycle. There was a recent report done by the Nuclear Energy Agency of the OECD on thorium systems. Can you make them work? Yes, you can make them work. Is there an advantage to doing it? I haven't seen it.
A new paper has just come out on thorium-powered nuclear reactors. Not quite so bullish on the case for thorium.
It's from Britain's National Nuclear Laboratory. So they say that there's about 4 times more thorium on Earth than there is uranium. But at the moment, uranium is cheap enough that simply doesn't matter.
It's, I think, one of these sort of technological cults.
Melting the fuel rods down in concentrated nitric acid from the thorium reactor, extracting 233, and then making more fuel rods with that and putting it in another reactor. It's economically totally out of the question. Go to my webpage, section on thorium reactors, written by physicists.
You just heard 3 different reports cited. One to a Congressional Committee on Energy, one to readers of The Economist, and one to the audience of Russia Today. All 3 reports overwhelmingly focus on the challenge of consuming thorium in solid fuel reactors. solid fuel reactors such as Shippingport, Atomic Power Station.
This reactor is going to cost something over $55 million, I believe. It will produce about 100,000 kilowatts of power.
The real object of this reactor is to learn about pressurized water reactors for atomic power. It will not be cheap to operate. It will be no cheaper to operate than Wright's Kitty Hawk would have been to carry passengers around. At the present time, reactor design is an art. It's not a science. We are trying to make a science out of it.
Rickover built one of these reactors and put it over here in Shippingport. A funny-looking submarine shell-shaped containment building.
Yeah, that's funny. My understanding was that he had a very aggressive timeline for the first power reactor. He was told it would take forever, and he pushed it through very quickly.
Absolutely. He was an absolute termagant, and other managers who have been less successful than they should have been were because they thought they were Rickover, and they weren't.
Shippingport was the first civilian commercial reactor in the world. For 25 years, we've never had any problem.
Why?
Because I have my representative sitting in that control room every minute that reactor is operating. If he sees one of the operators talking to another and it's not on business, he tells them to stop. If they don't stop, he shuts down the plant. And we have shut it down twice.
Now, you managed to recruit an extraordinary group of people and bring them in.
There are no good people waiting to be hired. All the good people already have good jobs. I did not recruit extraordinary people. I recruited people who had extraordinary potential, and then I trained them.
Tests of mechanisms in air and in room temperature water looked all right.
Never mind the good news, get to the problem.
Dynamic hot water tests from the labs. Some bearings froze, and some valves tended to seize up. Now, these results are just preliminary.
Damn
and
it,
the test
Adolf!
equipment may be at fault.
Our job is to anticipate the worst and then fix it. Did you know about this, Rockwell?
Yes, Admiral, I did.
And why the hell didn't you tell me about it?
Yes, sir, I guess I figured this was Panoff's area. I didn't want to take over his turf.
His turf? Does it matter to you if pumps and valves freeze up or the reactor control rod sticks?
Yes, sir, that would be disastrous, but it's
Then
only
it's your responsibility to tell me so. 100% your responsibility. And it's 100% Panoff's, and it's 100% Dunford's. The existence of these other people doesn't change your responsibility one whit.
He insisted on everyone being trained, everyone being up to quality, and no excuses. You know, you did it right and you did it right the first time.
This Shippingport Atomic Power Station on the Ohio River. It is the first full-scale nuclear power plant for generation of electricity in the United States.
Over its 25-year life, Shippingport was powered by various combinations of nuclear fuel, including one fuel load of thorium.
He wanted to prove he could make a light water breeder.
He kind of snuck Radkowski in there to put the thorium in. The people in charge now of the AEC were not interested in the breeding.
The only problem is the core turned into a gigantic, humongous Swiss watch that had to be that accurate with 1 million little springs holding it all together. He was trying to shoehorn different nuclear physics into an existing system. It made it very complicated and very difficult to work. He did that under the Naval Reactor Program. We used to have a separate Naval Reactors division here in this lab.
They developed and built the reactor for the world's first atomic submarine, the Nautilus. The story of the Nautilus is legend. Because of its success, it was used as a starting point in the development of an advanced design reactor for Shippingport. Its name, PWR, Pressurized Water Reactor.
The reason we have that as the base for our power reactor technology today is because the Navy was prepared to pay the first mover costs to make one work. And once you've done that, it's extraordinarily difficult to compete with it because those first mover costs are very, very high and have no financial return associated with them.
I became really quite friendly with Rickover. He spent better than a year, and that's where he learned about nuclear power.
See, was that about 1947?
It was 1947, yes. And it was I who urged on Rickover that the way to make a nuclear-powered submarine was with a pressurized water reactor.
You know, the Navy had reactors, and so the Air Force had to have reactors.
The Navy has built their nuclear submarines, and the Army has taken the same technology as the Navy, the water-cooled reactor, and they're doing their thing, but the Air Force wants to build a nuclear-powered bomber.
Dirty little secret was that most of the people involved in it knew from the get-go that it really wasn't practical. In contrast to a submarine where you've got limited space, but you can shield it for the people on the submarine, it's much harder on an airplane because of the weight.
Most of us did not really think that the aircraft reactor really could work. But we did feel that there was a very interesting technology there that someday could be applied.
And I would maintain that Weinberg was absolutely right in his assessment of the situation back then. He knew that to make the nuclear airplane work, they couldn't use water-cooled reactors. They couldn't use high-pressure reactors. They couldn't use complicated solid-fuel reactors. They had to have something that was so slick, that was so safe, that was so simple, that operated at low pressure, high temperatures, had all the features you wanted in it. They didn't even know what it was. I think someday this will be looked at as one of the great pivot points of history, that if this program, this nuclear airplane program, had not been established, the molten salt reactor would have never been invented, because it is simply too radical, too different, too completely out of the ball field of everything else for it to be arrived at through an evolutionary development. It had to be forced into existence by requirements that were so difficult to achieve, and the nuclear airplane was that.
Well, we were young chemical engineers at the time, and God smiles on young chemical engineers. They do things that in later years would be regarded as crazy.
The Navy program that led to the light water reactors we have now was well optimized to the needs of the Navy. It actually wasn't very well optimized to the needs of power production.
The reactor category advocated by Alvin Weinberg for civilian power production, the molten salt reactor, is covered in only 2 of the 3 reports dismissing thorium. So let's dismiss that third report by the anti-nuclear organization IEER and focus on the NNL and OECD reports. They do include sections on molten salt. The United Kingdom's NNL report correctly identifies the advantages offered by molten salt reactors in its molten salt reactor section. That is, page 23. However, the full implications of molten salt reactors are not examined throughout the different sections. For example, proliferation risk and reprocessing are covered as if spent fuel containing uranium-233 will be shuttled between the reactor, a reprocessing facility, and a spent fuel repository. That is not the case. Uranium-233 is both created and fissioned into energy inside the reactor itself. Unlike solid fuel alternatives, what emerges from the molten salt breeder does not represent a proliferation risk, nor a reprocessing challenge. A single part of the NNL report illustrates how this should have gone. Page 18. Recycling U-233 presents some difficult challenges in fuel fabrication because of the daughter products from U-232. Problems, challenges, technological barriers, technical risk. And then, at the bottom, MSR is unique in that it avoids these problems entirely with no fuel fabrication required. The NNL report could easily have a caveat carved out in every section regarding molten salt reactors. MSR impacts every aspect of the thorium fuel cycle, including proliferation. The sub-report cited as a molten salt reactor reference is in fact also focused on solid fuel as well, just like the main report. From a liquid fuel perspective, there's no meat in this report. The OECD report is another report focused on solid fuel. Like the NNL report, every section goes into detail about the challenges of thorium with solid fuel reactors. But it does offer a fairly meaty section on molten salt reactors. 11 pages. does the OECD report evaluate Alvin Weinberg's concept of the molten salt breeder and identify technical challenges which may impede development? Of those 11 pages in a 133-page report, one sentence does so. This 1 gigawatt design was a thermal reactor with graphite-moderated core that required heavy chemical fuel salt treatment with a removal time of approximately 30 days for soluble fission products, a drawback that could potentially be eliminated by using a fast spectrum instead. The remaining 10 pages of molten salt are then entirely dedicated to a different molten salt reactor concept, a fast spectrum molten salt reactor. If you don't know the meaning of moderator, fast spectrum, or fission products, then please bear with me. These terms will be explained, as will the need for chemical processing. The critical point is, the OECD report carefully dances around the thorium reactor options being promoted by advocates such as myself.
I know that our policy is very simple to understand, no nuclear. Is there more nuance demanded there because concerns about nuclear energy can be addressed with future technologies?
In a fast spectrum reactor, uranium and thorium perform the same. In a solid fuel reactor, uranium is a superior choice. It is only in Alvin Weinberg's thermal spectrum molten salt breeder reactor that thorium's advantages become clear.
And this is what I think is really worthy of consideration. Right now, we have to make an economic case for why should we consider thorium as a fuel source. We can go and we can mine uranium and we can enrich it and we can essentially burn out the small amount of uranium-235 in that. And you can put an economic quantification on the value of a gram of fissile material in the form of LEU. It's on the order of $10 to $15 out of the ground. That's what a gram of U-235 and that fuel represents. So if you want to make an economic case for why you're going to use the thorium fuel cycle, you better figure out how to turn a gram of thorium into fissile and fission it for less money than that. Otherwise, nobody's really going to care from an economic basis. And so this is why we want to pursue radical simplification in the reprocessing. We want to make it as simple as we possibly can, but no simpler.
The OECD report evaluates thorium based only on solid fuel reactors and fast spectrum molten salt reactors. It does not evaluate thorium based on Alvin Weinberg's molten salt breeder reactor.
When the idea of the breeder was first suggested in 1943, the rapid and efficient recycle of the partially spent core was regarded as the main problem. Nothing has happened in the ensuing quarter century that has fundamentally changed this. And I'll go further. Nothing has happened in the ensuing 40 years that has fundamentally changed this. Weinberg nailed the basic idea.
The media overlooked this gaping hole in the report, no mention of Alvin Weinberg, the molten salt reactor experiment, or of liquid chemistry. No mention of a buried sentence in the 100-page report. Let's reword it for clarity. This 1 gigawatt design was a thermal reactor with graphite-moderated core that avoided the drawbacks of fast spectrum by removing soluble fission products through the use of chemical fuel salt treatment.
The successful breeder will be the one that can deal with the spent fuel most rationally, either by achieving extremely long burnup or by greatly simplifying the entire recycle step. We at Oak Ridge have always been intrigued by this latter possibility. It explains our long commitment to liquid-fueled reactors, first the aqueous homogeneous and now the molten salt.
The second reactor actually operated very well. That was the molten salt reactor experiment.
There it is. This is the place.
These things right over here are the spent probes. See, those things would extend to like 60 foot in length. They went down the tank, did the melting, did this bubbling and stirring and everything. You had to go down an additional 25 to get to the top of the tanks. Then it actually you had to go inside the tanks. So those things would extend. So you got a pipe within a pipe.
The probe had heaters on the end of it. Then it would melt a pool in that salt and would sink down in it. So
all those long-handled tools they had for operations, it was almost heroic actions, you'd say, when they were trying to do things. And you've got this length of distance, and we'd certainly try to design things today that could be robotically handled. It just would not be designed the same way as it was at that point.
One of the things that I've learned from talking to some of the old-timers, people didn't disbelieve that we could build the machine. They didn't believe that we could maintain it.
Operation of the MSRE was not too difficult, and the people that I had working for me, they all had pound dogs under the porch, old cars out in the yard that didn't run very well. If anything came up side of the molten salt reactor, they said, "We fix that," and they did.
He felt like, despite the challenge of operating high radiation fields, that they were able to operate and maintain that machine over the course of its lifetime.
I started out at the lab in 1957 and got onto the molten salt reactor experiment. The dynamics were not common to reactors because it was molten salt instead of water-cooled solid fuel. If it heats up, it gets less dense, and that means it's less critical.
Or less reactive.
Yeah, less reactive.
Yeah. I was running some tests late at night. The device that I was using got stuck in the wrong place and pulled the rod out, and the power went up and up beyond the design power, and then controlled itself and went back down. Wow. Everybody was happy.
After they completed the molten salt reactor experiment, they went to the Atomic Energy Commission. They said, "Hey, gee, can we have some more money? We'd like to go now and build the real thing. We'd like to build the core, and we'd like to build the blanket, and we'd like to hook a power conversion system on and make electricity." And so they felt like they'd shot the moon. Well, the Atomic Energy Commission, unfortunately, did not share their zeal to continue with the technology. In addition to being a thorium guru, Weinberg was also the original inventor of the pressurized water reactor. He had invented it and gotten his patent for it in 1947. It was a little bit of a tricky thing to have the inventor of the light water reactor advocating for something very, very, very different. He didn't like the fact that it had to run at really high pressure. He just he saw that as a risk.
As long as the reactor was as small as the submarine intermediate reactor, which was only 60 megawatts, then containment shell was absolute. It was safe. But when you went to 1,000 megawatt reactors, you could not guarantee this.
He figured there would be an accident someday where you were not able to maintain the pressure or keep cooling it.
In some very remote situation, conceive of the containment being breached.
Does any of this sound familiar? He was making enough of a stink about this that a congressional leader named Chet Holofield told Alvin Weinberg, he said, "If you're so concerned about the safety of nuclear energy, it might be time for you to leave the nuclear business." And Weinberg was really kind of horrified that they would have this response to him because he wasn't questioning the value or the importance of nuclear energy. If anything, he was far more convinced about that than anyone else. What he was questioning had the right path been taken in the development of nuclear reactors. And he was particularly well suited to make that question because of his role as the inventor of the predominant technology. So he was quietly shown the door. After he left Oak Ridge, within very short order, the Atomic Energy Commission commissioned a report, WASH 1222. They really nitpicked on 3 very, very, very small issues about the reactor. And they said, "Look, big problems here. I don't think we can go forward until these are resolved." And when it came time to talk about the safety and the performance of the reactor, there may be some safety advantages that haven't been quantified yet regarding this approach, but we just really can't be sure about that. So, and I just burns me up because I think big mistake the United States made in 1972 in walking away from this. Do you feel like the program had a sound technical basis, or do you feel like technical problems were the basis for cancellation?
Some of the technical reasoning that I heard for the cancellation was that there was a corrosion problem.
Tritium was raised as another issue. We made no effort on MSRE to do anything with tritium.
Did the people on the program feel like tritium was an insurmountable problem?
We recognized that tritium would have to be captured, but most people thought that that's something that we should be able to do.
Did the people on the program, particularly the chemists or the material scientists, feel that corrosion was an insurmountable problem on the program?
No. Some of the subsequent experimental work seemed to bode very favorably for an ability to solve that issue. as well as the tritium issue, by the way, because we did do some tritium experiments.
Were either of you present when the molten salt reactor program was canceled in the early 70s?
Yeah, we were still working there.
Well, I was still working on the system. We were still finalizing reports on the performance of the MSRE.
I didn't see it coming.
Mr. President, since you missed our meeting on breeder reactor, we sent the message today, Craig. I told Ziegler to tell the press that it's a bipartisan effort. This has got to be something we play very close to the vest. But I am being ruthless on one thing. Any activities that we possibly can should be placed in Southern California. So on the committee, every time you have a chance, needle them, say, where's this going to be? Let's push the California thing. You do that?
Nixon was from California. Hosmer was from Southern California. Chet Holofield, who ran the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, was also from California. It doesn't lead me to believe that the president was seriously considering alternatives to the fast breeder reactor and other paths that could be taken. It was a focus on what can we do right now to get jobs.
Now, don't ask me what a breeder reactor is. All of this business about breeder reactors and nuclear energy and the stuff is over my head. That was one of my poorest subjects, science, and I got through it, but I had to work too hard. I gave it up when I was about a sophomore. But what I do know is this, that here we have the potentiality of a whole new breakthrough in the development of power for peace.
The fellow on the phone call that we heard earlier said that if cost targets were missed, I, for one, don't intend to scream and holler about it. In that same month, the Atomic Energy Commission issued WASH 1222. It almost completely ignored the safety and economic improvements possible through the use of the molten salt breeder reactor technology.
Milton Shaw, who was the head of reactor development in Washington, called up and says, stop that MSRE reactor experiment, fire everybody, just tell them to clear out their desk and go home, and send me the money for fast breeders.
We were competing with the fast breeder people at Argonne mainly. They just had more political sway than the molten salt reactor.
Do you see a prevailing opinion here about molten salt reactors?
We haven't been funded to look at molten salt reactors.
There's no opinions about
the opinion is simple. Build IFR, that's it.
Okay, that's the opinion. Okay.
We realized that we were minor league money-wise compared to the other program.
One anecdote that I heard, he said, put your hand on your desk, take everything that has to do with molten salt, sweep it off, and you're finished.
I saved all my documents.
I did too.
You look at the authors of the papers that I listed, most of them are deceased. Grimes, Rainey, they're deceased. All the technical skill is gone. And I'm reading ORNL documents fiendishly to try and go, okay, I think I would have did that. I think I would have did that. But I don't know. I don't know because I don't have anybody to talk to.
We had a corpus of people in Oak Ridge who knew how to do this in the mid-1970s. They're literally dead and gone now. I've met a handful of them. They're in their 80s. They're not going to do this anymore.
Well, Beecher's been dead for a long time.
How about Paul?
Paul, I have not had any contact with him, so I don't know.
You don't get taught this stuff in nuclear engineering school. I said one time in an online talk, you could get a PhD in nuclear engineering and never learn about this stuff. I got an email a few weeks ago. Kirk, I just saw your talk. I want you to know I just graduated from Purdue with my PhD in nuclear engineering. And I want to tell you, you're absolutely right. I have never heard of this stuff before. And he goes, I want to tell you, it's even worse than that because he goes, I'm totally a student of nuclear history. He goes, I'm so geeked out on nuclear history. And I've never heard of this. How did I not hear this? He goes, it's great though. He goes, you're absolutely right. This is top-notch stuff they did and we should be working on it right now. But it's absolutely possible for you to go through a normal curriculum and never learn about this.
In any other place, like if as an organization, we're abandoning this route and going another, well, it just gets lost. It's amazing how much they documented.
Enormous amounts of detail about the work that had been accomplished and how they had developed the technology.
They were written to very high scientific standards that we can go back and do once again, or repeat once again, things that were initially studied back in the 1960s and 1970s.
Now, you were aware of the molten salt reactor experiment.
There were some journal articles that gave basic background.
They had a full issue of a pretty substantial nuclear engineering journal.
But the thing that was missing was this extensive compendium of 100-page reports that gave enormous amounts of detail about the work that had been accomplished and how they had developed the technology. And using that, we were able to accelerate our work in looking at how to develop fluoride salt-cooled high-temperature reactors, a variant of the earlier molten salt reactor technology.